Japan wants to dump about 500 Olympic-sized swimming pools worth of radioactive wastewater into the Pacific Ocean. That's an unprecedented amount, and not everybody's sure that's a good idea.
후쿠시마 오염 방류수를 내보내는 것도 그렇고 여기서 이제 그로 인해서 이제 오염이 되면 건강에서도 이제 문제가 있고.
Japan insists it's safe. The world's nuclear watchdog, the International Atomic Energy Agency, also says it's safe. But the middle ground here is, how can anyone actually say for sure?
I worked on the Chernobyl accident for 30 years, and whatever happens to do with Chernobyl, people understandably associate it with those terrible events, and the same is true of Fukushima.
So let me explain what Japan's plan actually is, what science there is that backs it up, and why so many people still wonder if we're all just going to be eating radioactive tuna 50 years from now.
The ground was already shaking when this camera started to roll in an office about 100 kilometers from the epicenter. But as frightening as the tremors were, it was about to get a lot worse.
When Japan was devastated by a massive earthquake and tsunami in 2011, thousands dead, hundreds of thousands of buildings damaged or destroyed, the fallout from its ruptured nuclear power plant was one of the top concerns.
Today, Japan officially recognized the severity of the threat posed by the leaking Fukushima reactors by upgrading it to a Category 5 incident. That's on par with the 3 Mile Island nuclear disaster and 2 notches below the worst ever at Chernobyl.
But the problem today is all the contaminated water that's been accumulating there since. There's about 1.3 million tons of it. Remember those 500 Olympic-sized swimming pools? Well, they don't use pools, they use giant steel tanks, about 1,000 of them. The problem is, they're almost full because new water keeps getting contaminated, both rainwater and groundwater. So they treat this water to remove most of the radioactive elements inside, but there's still one left, called tritium. It's difficult to remove. And so the plan is to take all that treated radioactive wastewater, dilute it thousands of times over, and then gradually release it into the Pacific Ocean over the next 30 to 40 years, starting this year. There's effectively a giant pipe, about a kilometer long, that will shoot the water out. And they want to do this because ultimately they need to decommission the plant. And you can't do that until the water's gone. Tritium is a version of hydrogen that's radioactive, but it's pretty weak and considered pretty harmless. So, for example, your skin is enough to block it. The Japanese government says even just a sheet of paper will stop tritium in its tracks. The problem is when you inhale or eat it. I was trying to look for studies about tritium exposure, but most of what you find is about the health impact in animals, with human studies being a little less conclusive. According to the world's nuclear watchdog, there's only a health risk when you're talking about very large doses of tritium, which we're usually never exposed to. Like, did you know you can find tritium in Canadian tap water? It occurs naturally in the environment. It can even rain down, but in very trace amounts that are considered to be safe. So, if we get back to the Japanese plan, here's how they see it. A stomach X-ray exposes you to about 3 millisieverts of radiation. Natural radiation exposure, so, just living your day-to-day life in Japan, 2.1 millisieverts. Hopping on a round-trip flight, Tokyo to New York, around 0.1 millisieverts. An X-ray at the dentist, about 1/10 of that amount, and then, at a fraction of that amount, what the government believes will be the annual human exposure as it releases wastewater into the ocean.
Would I drink it? Yes. So the tritium, by the time it's gone through the pipeline and it's been diluted 100 times, it's going to have about 1,500 becquerels per litre of tritium. And the World Health Organization drinking water standard for tritium is 10,000 becquerels per litre, so it's about 7 times below that.
So the UN's nuclear agency has spent the last 2 years looking over Japan's plan and just announced yesterday it's good. The plan's a go.
The plan, as it has been proposed and devised, is in conformity with the agreed international standards.
And we should point out, it's not at all unusual for nuclear wastewater to be pumped into the ocean. You know, in the last couple of years, South Korea, China, Taiwan, and yes, Japan have all released wastewater containing tritium into the Pacific. The difference here is volume and wastewater discharge over such a long period, decades.
So it's a big volume, but actually in terms of radioactivity, once it's treated, it's a very low amount.
According to the UN's nuclear agency, discharging the treated water would have a negligible radiological impact on people and the environment. China has been opposed since the start, calling this whole plan extremely irresponsible. South Korea is also opposed. Shoppers there have even been scooping up sea salt in droves because, you know, once Japan starts pumping the ocean with radioactive water, who wants radioactive sea salt? Even locally in Japan, the fishing industry is very skeptical. Not necessarily because they question the science, but remember what happened after the earthquake and tsunami in 2011.
Fears of contaminated food are spreading overseas.
South Korea has banned the import of seafood products from 8 Japanese prefectures.
The US FDA only recently, in the last couple of years, lifted the last remaining restrictions on Japanese food imports. And South Korea still bans food imports coming from the area around Fukushima. So fishers worry if this plan to dump radioactive water into the ocean goes ahead, the hit to consumer confidence would be devastating. Like, all the work they've done to rebuild since the initial disaster would be completely undone. So here's the thing. Ultimately, this plan has a giant question mark around it because it's never been done on this scale before. And in an ocean, by the way, that isn't exactly pristine to begin with.
To pretend that, well, this is just radionuclides is irresponsible because this is radionuclides on top of climate change, on top of global warming, on top of ocean acidification, on top of pollution, on top of plastics.
And that's important because, you know, while you can rarely point to any one thing as being so cataclysmically problematic for humanity, it is kind of the sum total of our shenanigans where the real damage is done, right?
There are real problems in the Pacific, as we all know, you know, climate change, plastic pollution, overfishing. These are real issues, and I think this is a bit of a distraction, really.
So the bottom line is this. The exact risk of this kind of long-term, low-dose exposure to tritium is unknown. And in terms of global problems, maybe this isn't the biggest one, but the stakes are high, regardless. We don't have that many oceans on this planet, and once the damage is done, it's very hard to undo.